begin by saying it's a great pleasure for me to come here tonight. It's not the only reason I've come back to Australia, actually, but nevertheless it's a happy coincidence. And to come here with Denis White to launch his book. I think what he's done is a wonderful thing to produce this book. It's gone through a few iterations and had some arguments with publishers, I think, in the past, but it's a great thing that it's finally been put together. It's not long, and so, Denis, I would say I wish it were a bit longer, but nevertheless, it may be brief, but it makes very strong and very profound points about Malcolm Fraser, actually not just about his time as the Prime Minister, but also a little bit about his time as opposition leader as well, which was such a dramatic period in Australian history. So my interest in this is much more personal than any of you might imagine. You might just think I'm some retired Liberal Party politician who you vaguely have heard of. And I've noticed how quickly people do forget you. I was at a pre-polling booth in Higgins a couple of days ago, and a man there who was in his 80s looked at me, and he was a Liberal. He was handing out how to vote cards for the Liberal Party, and he said to me, "Look, I know your face, you look vaguely familiar." You look vaguely familiar. I just thought, gosh, all those years, I was the leader of the opposition for nearly 12 years, I was the foreign minister, you're a die-hard Liberal, and you've already forgotten me. Heartbreaking. So that brings me really to the first point that I want to make, which is a point about the Liberal Party. One of the things the Labour Party does very well is that it keeps its leaders' reputations intact as best they possibly can. I mean, it seems to me an extraordinary thing that the Labour Party can swallow the reputation of somebody like Kevin Rudd, but you won't hear them going out slagging Kevin Rudd anymore, because they know that institutionally it's important that they look upon their previous leaders, particularly those who have become Prime Minister, look upon those favourably and build their reputations, because that affects the broader public perception of the political party and the political movement. And I think the Liberal Party has been very poor at that. Often the Liberal Party has criticised its former leaders, and actually, hopefully this is one thing you'll have forgotten about me. I am one of the former leaders. Yes, that's fortunate. You've all forgotten. Thank you, Tony Staley, for all the support you gave me, but to get me there in the first place. I'll come back to that. But the Liberal Party has criticised, dismissed, derided too many of its former leaders and its former Prime Ministers. And I think back to people like Billy McMahon and John Gorton, and let's face it, Malcolm Fraser, one of the longest serving Prime Ministers of Australia, a hugely important person in the political history and in the economic history of this country. So I know the Liberal Party and Malcolm Fraser had a real falling out in later years. I'm obviously very familiar with that. On the other hand, I think it is really important as a political movement that we come to a reassessment of the reputation of Malcolm Fraser as both an opposition leader and as the Prime Minister, because I think he had a wonderful record and achieved many great things. And whatever he said about the Liberal Party in his latter years should not be allowed to diminish his great achievements during his time in office and the great contribution he made to Australia. So I just go back to my own personal involvement. I came across Denis White when he was the Chief of Staff to Malcolm Fraser, and he hired me as a kind of junior political advisor and speech writer. I was just in my 20s, back from serving with DFAT in Brussels as a sort of third secretary. I think I became the second secretary, actually. I got promoted while I was there. So I had this wonderful opportunity to work in Malcolm Fraser's office, which for what turned out to be the last 10 or so months of the Fraser government, working with Denis and people like Cliff Walsh and John Rose and so on. And it was a simply extraordinary experience working with Malcolm Fraser. Well, should I say, working for Malcolm Fraser, because we all worked for him. I know the current languages work with, but we definitely worked for him. So I came to know him very well through that period, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But my early recollections of Malcolm Fraser, who was a friend of my mother and father's, as was Tammy, was of an extraordinarily powerful figure. And when he became the leader of the opposition, you'll recall replacing Billy Snedden. No disrespect to Billy Snedden, but I thought this was a wonderful day for Australia. There was Gough Whitlam reigning relatively supreme, he himself a very powerful, authoritative figure, and along came Malcolm Fraser, somebody who has something every political leader really needs, and that is natural authority. And that is a quality he exuded, natural authority. When you saw him on television or when you met him, you were in the presence of somebody with great power. And I don't mean just theoretical power coming from his position as opposition leader or prime minister, but the power of his personality. And Tony Staley will know how he completely dominated his government. He completely dominated his advisors. He wasn't always very polite to us, if I may say so. Language now that would be regarded as entirely politically incorrect in chastising us, but you know, we happily went along with it, by the way. But a figure of very great natural authority. Every great leader is a person of high intelligence, and Malcolm Fraser certainly had that. Every great leader is a person who has conviction, and he was somebody who had very substantial conviction. Every great leader is a person who has courage, and he had extraordinary political courage. He's sometimes criticised for not having done this and that and the other, and he should have done more when he was Prime Minister and so on. Well, even to get there, and the way he got there showed enormous political courage, and he was a man of great courage. And finally, every great leader needs to have empathy with the public and an affection and a love of his or her country. And in Malcolm Fraser's case, that was absolutely true. He was a great patriot, a man who had a great passion for and a great love of Australia. And, you know, he dedicated his work and dedicated his prime ministership and his time as the opposition leader to advancing the national interest. He wasn't a man who needed to advance his own personal interest, but he advanced the national interest in such an important way. I always thought he was somebody who had very clear philosophical foundations. So I would make an argument that I said all great leaders should have conviction, that they need to frame their leadership with a philosophical foundation. And as Menzies did, and Menzies often spoke of his philosophy, his belief in, I think to use Menzies' phrase, the selfless individualism. It's a good expression. Malcolm Fraser, he was somebody who I think in a lot of ways inherited the Menzies tradition. I always thought he was somebody who believed very passionately in the equal value of all individual people and the dignity of individuals. So when you look at what the Fraser government did, setting up institutions which have become a bit more controversial as the years have gone by, but setting up institutions like the Human Rights Commission, the Ombudsman's Office, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and so on, behind setting up these institutions was the idea of protecting the individual from the authority of the state, the Freedom of Information Act as well. I was working in his office there in the end of 1982 when the Freedom of Information Act came into force. We had to do a bit of shredding, didn't we, Denis, before the Act came into force on the 1st of January 1983. I think we shredded everything that would be worth having a look at. But all these initiatives of Malcolm Fraser's were designed to protect individuals from the power and the authority of the state. So too was his approach to economic management. It was very liberal, as in a capital L liberal, a very liberal approach, a very Menzian approach. I suppose you would say he believed in the continuation of the traditional arrangements in Australia of having relatively high levels of tariff protection and a centralised industrial relations system, a conciliation and arbitration commission and so on. He kind of believed, I suppose, maybe subconsciously in the continuation of that, not revolutionising it and overthrowing all of those institutions and those arrangements in Australia. But nevertheless, he did believe, you know, in one of those things, to use an old-fashioned expression, which seems very old-fashioned now, he believed, very unfashionable, he believed in sound money and making sure that the government didn't overspend, making sure that the state didn't, in economic terms, expand its remit to undermine entrepreneurship and individual enterprise and the competitive private market. And the Fraser government did great things to salvage the economy, if I could put it that way, from the ravages of the Whitlam government. And don't forget that, the huge task the Fraser government had after they were elected to wind back the massive deficits that had been accumulated by the Whitlam government, the inflation that Australia had, the economic chaos that our country was thrown into by the Whitlam government. Malcolm Fraser reversed all of that and restored economic stability to the country. I don't think we should forget these things at all. So, what do I think ultimately? I think we need a reappraisal of the record of Malcolm Fraser and of the Fraser government. And we need to make sure in the Liberal Party and in the institutions associated with the Liberal Party that we uphold Malcolm Fraser's reputation, not tear it down. Because this man was a great man. He was a great Prime Minister and he was a great leader of our nation. And amongst all of his achievements, you'd have to say one of his greatest was that he rid this country of the Whitlam government. I know he did it in a ruthless way, and I know it was a debatable way, but let's face it, in December 1975, I think it was December the 13th, 1975, it might be wrong, but I think it was, in the general election, the Liberal Party won, or the coalition won, the biggest majority that any political party has ever won in Australia's political history. And since then, that has not been exceeded, not even by the Howard government in 1996, which did quite well then too. I was the Foreign Minister for a long time, as that man on the polling booth had clearly forgotten. I know I was very quiet in that role, but still. I think I should finish by saying that Malcolm Fraser cut quite a figure on the international stage. So you think back to Malcolm Fraser and you ask yourself the question that you might be asking as we move towards the 21st of May. Would this man look good as the leader of our country in international meetings? How would he perform with the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom or whoever it might be? And the fact is, Malcolm Fraser held our reputation as a country up and did so with great dignity and with great power. I only travelled with him on one major international trip, which was to China. We also went to the Philippines and New Zealand. But he was such a powerful figure, such a dominant figure, and so important in terms of upholding Australia's reputation on the international scale. And he brought to international relations that philosophical foundation he had about the dignity and the equal value of individuals. He abhorred Soviet communism. And you'll all recall, or some of you will recall, his really vicious reaction, an entirely appropriate reaction to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. But also the amazing work he did to turn back the apartheid regime in South Africa and also in what is now called Zimbabwe. I mean, you know, things may have gone wrong subsequently in Zimbabwe, but from Australia's point of view, it was really important that we upheld the dignity of individuals regardless of their race or their religion or their national origin. And Malcolm Fraser passionately believed that, and he did that, and his reputation is remembered to this very day around the world for the things he stood for. I suppose I should finally say, what was he like as an individual? What was he like to work for? And I mentioned that a little earlier, but he could, I think, in terms of his public persona, seem to people a little austere. But privately he was often austere, but he wasn't always austere. I can remember talking of that trip I went on with Malcolm Fraser, coming back through New Zealand, and we went to Rotorua. We went to Rotorua because in Rotorua the New Zealanders were hosting the South Pacific Forum, the Pacific Islands Forum as it's nowadays called. And we were in the Sheraton Hotel in Rotorua, in the top floor, and Malcolm Fraser, as the Prime Minister, had a very big suite at the end of the corridor. This was his pattern. You know, at the end of the day, we would go into his suite and sit around and have drinks, and there were drinks aplenty. And they weren't just any old drink, by the way. It was Grange Hermitage. He loved Grange Hermitage. We even had Grange Hermitage on the VIP planes in those days. There was a plane called the BAC 111, British Aircraft Corporation 111, which was one of the VIP planes. Anyway, we had Grange Hermitage on that plane. But this evening in Rotorua, there was much Grange Hermitage drunk. Underneath Malcolm Fraser's suite, and this was about midnight, we were all sitting around drinking and talking and laughing and making, no doubt, a terrible hullabaloo. Beneath was Piggy Muldoon, the New Zealand Prime Minister. Now, Malcolm Fraser abhorred Piggy Muldoon. They had a really, really bad relationship. I remember Malcolm getting up and stamping on the floor, saying, "I hope I'm keeping Piggy Muldoon wide awake." I'm sure we did. We left very early the next morning, and we never saw Sir Robert Muldoon. We never saw him again. I think, in the end, when Malcolm Fraser died in 2015, I was the Australian High Commissioner in London, and I decided that we would have at Australia House a memorial service for him, and we would remember the great contribution he made as the opposition leader and as the Prime Minister to Australia. And we had some distinguished British politicians come along to that. I think William Hague did. and who had been the leader of the Conservative Party and was for some period the Foreign Secretary. And I can't remember now whether at that time he was the Foreign Secretary or it was just after he'd completed his term, but nevertheless he was there, and other distinguished British politicians. And I felt it was the least I could do to have a memorial service for a man who was such a great Australian. And many people turned up, and I think it was an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the great contribution he made to our country in his life. So I spent a lot of time talking about Malcolm Fraser tonight, and I haven't spent very much time talking about him for the last few years, because I know when I was a member of the Howard government, he took, as time went on, an increasingly negative view of the Howard government. He wasn't always very tactful, and at one stage while I was the foreign minister, Tony Staley will like this, I was talking to Malcolm Fraser, and he was telling me how bad the Howard government was, and didn't like John Howard very much. And he said to me, I wouldn't have a single member of the current government in my government if I were the Prime Minister. And I thought to myself, well, there am I. I'm like the third most senior person in the government as the Foreign Minister, and you wouldn't even have me. He wouldn't have meant it quite in that way. And if I'd been a sensitive flower, but like him, I can take a huge amount of criticism without worrying too much about that. He did fall out with the Liberal Party, and he did fall out with the government in the end. Do you know what I think? I think we should just move on, accept that people are always entitled to their own views and their own opinions, as we know. But we should remember him for the great contribution he made to Australia, that great and towering figure who made our nation proud on the world stage. So Denis, thank you very much for writing the book. And we all look forward to, all of you, I hope, will look forward to buying it and to reading it. I have read it, but I think you'll find it incredibly interesting. So thank you very much.
Alexander and so many people, Tammy, Tony Staley, John Rhodes, I'm so glad, John, that you made it, so many other people here. Thank you, Alexander, for launching the book, for taking the trouble. It doesn't take a great deal of time to read it because it's quite short, but you obviously read it carefully and thought about the message that it tells. I recall the time when Alexander and I were working together. We were both in the old Parliament House in offices a bit like shoeboxes, really, with a very narrow corridor between us, and our doors faced each other. And you were saying that we worked for Malcolm as perhaps a bit more than we worked for him, and the demands were remarkable. I recall one day there'd been a headline in the paper that some tax official in Perth had been found to have in his desk a rather incriminating document. I don't know what was amiss, but there was something that was really terribly wrong. So we were sitting in our offices, and suddenly Malcolm, this towering figure, walked through and came into my office, and he said, "We need a review of the public service. Would you draw me some terms of reference?" And I said, "Yes, Prime Minister." And then I sort of turned to what I was doing for a moment, and about 2 minutes later, Malcolm came back. "Have you got those terms of reference?" Alexander understands what I mean. But I want to thank Nick Cater very much for publishing, for seeing the kind of understanding of what Fraser was that Alexander has articulated so beautifully for us, because he was a truly remarkable figure. Nick, I think, has written that he was a leader of considerable substance. I think he was perhaps a bit more than that. Nick, the word considerable perhaps understates what this man really was like. I feel tremendously privileged about having had the opportunity to write this small book, and to have worked for him and to have known him. I continued to work for him, to consult with him really, and he used to ring me up quite often. As in the years after he left office, he continued to engage with politics, and I think an aspect of the fact that you talked about, that he fell out with the Liberal Party, an aspect of that very sad fact was that Malcolm never sought to defend his own reputation. He went on trying to do the right thing, as he saw it, by Australia and by the world. He rang me up one morning and said, "Denis, I'm working for a group and we're trying to develop a universal declaration of human responsibilities." He wondered if I could do a draft of it. But I mean, that was, he retained his commitment to what he thought was right. He went, some of us would think he didn't always go in the right direction, and it was sad in many ways, but the reality is that he was this extraordinary figure who did continue to push what he saw as the right thing for Australia and the world. It's worth understanding a little bit about what some people said about him, and what he was like in company with people of the highest calibre. I had the good fortune to attend 2 dinners at which Malcolm and Henry Kissinger were present, and they were talking about international affairs. I'd been an academic. I'd never actually studied international relations, but over the years I'd been at dozens of academic discussions about various international matters. And to hear Henry Kissinger and Malcolm Fraser talk about foreign policy was just to hear something, was like comparing Bradman to Alexander or I playing cricket. They were just in a different order. I don't know how good you were at cricket, Alexander, but I don't think you were perhaps in that range. Another public servant once said to me that he'd heard Henry Kissinger say that Malcolm had a genius for foreign affairs. And I once mentioned this to Malcolm, that Henry had said this, and he made the fascinating observation. He said, "Oh yes," he said, "Henry and I," he said, it was very interesting. He said, "We agreed about nearly every political matter, every policy decision, we were agreed, but we had completely different views about the nature of foreign policy." And I said to him, "Well, what was the difference?" And he said, "Well, he saw it as like moving pieces on a board. I saw it as about relationships between people." And here I thought this was a level of understanding of international matters that was different. I'm going to paraphrase a little and just read to you something that Kissinger wrote about Fraser. It won't take me too long. He said, He said, few modern statesmen are interesting because of their own ideas, and most of them even lose a sense of the importance. Then he said, Malcolm Fraser was always an extraordinary exception to such generalities. He found, he said, Malcolm Fraser, both in and out of office, an uncommonly interesting man and thinker. And then in 1985, when he was writing, he went further and said, in something more than a generation, the axis of world politics will shift to the Pacific. And at that point, Australia will be at the vortex of world affairs. And Australia will not then be able to improvise either a theory or relationships to navigate that passage. And then he said, no Australian leader has understood this more clearly than Malcolm Fraser. So I think it's fascinating that Malcolm, at that level, was like that. And I want to tell you another story about a dinner he had once with the Vice-Chancellors of Australia's universities. You'd imagine that these high-level academic people, that they might be at a different level. But there was an extraordinary thing because the chairman of the Vice-Chancellors Committee opened the meeting by saying, Prime Minister, we're your Vice-Chancellors. What do you think we should be doing? I was astonished. Malcolm was horrified that the Vice-Chancellors should regard him as really their boss. He looked just almost sick. But this man said, what do you think we should be doing? And the fact that he was on a different level, he showed by the sort of answer he gave. He didn't know what to say, but it was a period when people were dissatisfied with universities, when students were falling away, and he said, well, I don't know, but it's not my business, but I think what you should be doing is making the getting of a university education the dream it was for young people 20 years ago. And here was again a perception of a big point about education and universities. And then I'm going to say just another word about a meeting he had with Deng Xiaoping. You were at that visit to China. And Malcolm opened the meeting. Deng Xiaoping, he was Lee Kuan Yew regarded him as the most impressive statesman he ever met. Henry Kissinger said the same. He was an extraordinary figure. But Malcolm was talking with him, and Malcolm somehow opened the conversation, and he said, how is modernisation going? And Deng said, well, it's very difficult, because just after the Cultural Revolution, he said the economy has been smashed. Our education system has been smashed. Our transport system doesn't exist. Our health system's gone. Everything's wrecked. So he painted an awful picture of China. And then, I didn't realise at the time, I could see he was working round to testing Fraser. And then he said, and we have no young leaders. All our leaders are old. So it's not only that we've got no economy and no this and no that, but we don't have any young leaders. And then he said, I am one of the old. And turned the question over to Fraser. So here was Malcolm having to respond to the comments from the leader of China that he was really too old for the job that he was doing. And Malcolm, without batting an eyelid, said, age depends on the mind. So there was the perfect answer. Straight out, extraordinary answer, really. And then Malcolm went on to win the debate because all Deng could say was, well, but age tells and I can't work a full day. So he really forced Deng to admit he wasn't really up to the job anymore. So he was a remarkable person. And I've tried in this book to give a sense of his stature and of what he was on about. his reason for why going into politics is itself fascinating, because he was a very shy young man, I believe. People who knew him as a teenager said that he was very awkward at parties and didn't relate to people terribly easily. But I talked to him on a couple of occasions about why he went into politics, and he said he once tried to write about it, but what he said was that when he'd been at Oxford, he'd read all the great thinkers, or read a lot of them, and he found that every one of them had answers to some of the big questions, but none of them had answers to all of them. And he said, that's why I went into politics, because, as he saw it, the answers had to be found in action and in life and in living. And here, if ever there was a high reason for going into politics. And he certainly wasn't extraordinarily committed through his time and through his life to trying to do something about the condition of things as he found them. So I hope it's a very short book, as we've said, but anyway, it was a great pleasure to me to write it. I'm so honoured that Nick has decided to publish it. I'd like to say also how pleased Malcolm would be to know who was here tonight, that Tabby was here, that Tony Staley was here, that David Kemp was here, that John Rose is here, all these people who worked, and of course that Alexander was here, but all these people who worked for him and helped him to do what he tried to do as life went on. So good luck with having a look at the book at the end of the passage if you're interested. And thank you very much again, Nick.